Picture this scene. Scar towers over Sarabi, his voice dripping with contempt as he demands her submission. She stands defiant, her golden eyes locked with his green ones, refusing to bow. Most viewers see this as a moment of brave but futile resistance, a queen making her final stand before inevitable defeat. But what if everything we think we know about this scene is wrong? What if Sarabi wasn't making a desperate last stand, but executing the final phase of a carefully orchestrated rebellion that had been running for years right under Scar's nose? The evidence has been hiding in plain sight all along. Every frame, every gesture, every carefully chosen word points to a stunning truth that Disney never explicitly told us, but encoded in the animation itself. Sarabi wasn't just Mufasa's grieving widow clinging to the past. She was a master strategist running the most sophisticated resistance operation in Disney history. Think about it logically. When Scar assumed power, he inherited a complex social structure built over generations. Prides aren't just random collections of lions, they're intricate political systems where the lionesses hold the real operational power. They hunt, they raise the cubs, they maintain the territory. The male lion might wear the crown, but the females run the kingdom. Scar understood this partially. That's why his first political move wasn't just claiming the throne, it was attempting to force Sarabi into becoming his queen. He knew that without her legitimacy, his rule would always be contested. But here's where his understanding failed him completely. He assumed that controlling Sarabi meant controlling the pride. He couldn't have been more wrong. What Scar never realized was that in trying to dominate the queen, he had handed the resistance movement its perfect cover story. Every act of apparent submission was actually a chess move in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Look at the evidence with fresh eyes. During Scar's reign, the Pride Lands became a wasteland. Animals fled, water dried up, prey disappeared. Yet somehow, inexplicably, the lionesses survived. Not just survived, they maintained their social structure, their hunting formations, their collective identity. How is this possible in an ecosystem that had supposedly collapsed completely? The answer lies in understanding what really happened during those dark years. While Scar was busy congratulating himself on his political victory, Sarabi was quietly maintaining a shadow government. She wasn't just keeping the lionesses fed, she was keeping the pride's institutional memory alive, maintaining their skills, and most importantly, keeping them unified and ready for the inevitable restoration. Consider the hunting patterns. Lions are collaborative hunters requiring precise coordination and established hierarchies. These skills don't maintain themselves, they require constant practice and leadership. Yet, when Simba returns, the lionesses immediately demonstrate perfect tactical coordination in the final battle. This level of organizational readiness doesn't happen by accident. It requires leadership, planning, and continuous preparation. But Sarabi's genius went deeper than simple survival tactics. She understood something that Scar, in his narcissistic rage, completely missed. The real power in any political system doesn't come from fear or force. It comes from legitimacy and consent. And consent can be withdrawn just as deliberately as it's given. Every interaction between Sarabi and Scar becomes a masterclass in psychological warfare when viewed through this lens. Her apparent compliance masked a systematic campaign of resistance that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. She maintained the lioness's loyalty not through dramatic speeches or violent confrontation, but through the steady, patient work of true leadership. This wasn't the resistance of desperation. This was the resistance of someone who understood that the current situation was temporary and was methodically preparing for its end. Sarabi wasn't trying to survive Scar's reign. She was ensuring that when it ended, there would still be a pride worthy of restoration. The brilliance of her strategy becomes clear when we examine what didn't happen during Scar's rule. There were no attempted coups, no public challenges to his authority, no dramatic confrontations that would give him excuse for brutal retaliation. Instead, there was something far more dangerous to a tyrant: the quiet, persistent maintenance of an alternative power structure that made his authority increasingly irrelevant. This was political warfare at its most sophisticated level. While Scar was playing the game of dominance and submission, Sarabi was playing an entirely different game. One focused on preservation, preparation, and patient strategic positioning. She understood that true power isn't about controlling others through fear, but about maintaining the conditions necessary for legitimate leadership to eventually reassert itself. The psychological dimension of her resistance reveals layers of complexity that transform our understanding of the entire story. This wasn't just about surviving until Simba returned. This was about ensuring that when he did return, he would find a kingdom worth reclaiming and lionesses ready to reclaim it. The most revealing evidence of Sarabi's sophisticated resistance campaign lies not in what she said, but in what she didn't say. And more importantly, in how she positioned herself during every interaction with Scar. When we analyze her body language frame by frame, a pattern emerges that completely contradicts the narrative of defeated submission. Watch Sarabi's posture during any scene with Scar. Her spine remains straight, her shoulders squared, her head held at a precise angle that manages to show neither deference nor open challenge. This isn't accidental. In lion social dynamics, posture communicates everything about status and intention. A truly defeated lioness would lower her head, avoid eye contact, and position herself below the dominant male. Sarabi does none of these things. Instead, she maintains what behavioral psychologists call contained authority, a stance that acknowledges the current power structure while refusing to validate it emotionally. She's physically present but psychologically absent from Scar's dominance games. This kind of calculated non-compliance requires enormous self-control and strategic thinking. Compare this to genuinely submissive lionesses in other Disney films. In Tarzan, when the gorillas show submission to Kerchak, their entire body language shifts. Shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, movement patterns that clearly communicate acceptance of subordinate status. Even in nature documentaries, we see clear physical markers of submission and lion prides. Sarabi exhibits none of these behaviors. More telling is her use of eye contact. In the animal kingdom, direct eye contact between a subordinate and dominant individual is typically either a challenge or a submission ritual. Sarabi does neither. She employs what can only be described as diplomatic eye contact, acknowledging Scar's presence without conceding his authority. She looks at him the way one head of state might look at another during tense negotiations, not the way a subject looks at a ruler. This becomes even more significant when we consider the lioness hierarchy within the pride. Lionesses don't just follow any female, they follow the one with the strongest combination of experience, wisdom, and demonstrated capability. The fact that the other lionesses consistently position themselves in relation to Sarabi, not Scar, during group scenes reveals where the real power structure remained intact. Watch the subtle choreography during the hunting scenes. Despite the apparent scarcity and chaos of Scar's reign, the lionesses move with practiced coordination. Someone has been maintaining their hunting formations, their communication signals, their tactical awareness. This level of operational readiness doesn't happen without leadership, and it certainly doesn't happen if that leadership has been psychologically broken. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Sarabi's psychological warfare was her strategic use of silence. In every confrontation with Scar, she chooses her words with surgical precision, saying just enough to avoid direct punishment while revealing nothing about her true thoughts or plans. This isn't the silence of fear. It's the silence of someone who understands that information is power, and power should never be surrendered carelessly. Consider the timing of her responses to Scar's provocations. She never reacts immediately, never responds from emotion, never gives him the satisfaction of visible impact. Instead, there's always a calculated pause, just long enough to demonstrate that she's choosing her response rather than being compelled to give one. This kind of emotional control under extreme pressure indicates someone operating from a position of internal strength, not defeated resignation. The psychological pressure she applied was relentless but invisible. By refusing to grant Scar emotional validation for his dominance, she denied him one of the most crucial components of authoritarian control, the psychological submission of his subjects. Every interaction became a reminder that his power was based on force rather than legitimacy, that he ruled through fear rather than respect. This psychological dynamic created a fascinating reversal. While Scar became increasingly desperate for validation, notice how his demands for submission become more explicit and aggressive over time. Sarabi became more composed and controlled. She was winning a war of attrition that Scar didn't even realize was being fought. But the most brilliant aspect of her strategy was how she used these psychological tactics to recruit and maintain the loyalty of the other lionesses. By demonstrating that it was possible to maintain dignity and identity under Scar's rule, she provided a model for resistance that didn't require open rebellion. She showed them that they could comply with his demands without surrendering their souls to his authority. This created a fascinating parallel power structure. Officially, Scar was the king and the lionesses were his subjects. Unofficially, Sarabi remained their leader, their source of guidance and strength. They looked to her for cues about how to respond to Scar's demands, when to comply and when to subtly resist. She had created a resistance network that operated entirely through nonverbal communication and shared understanding. The genius of this approach was that it left Scar in an impossible position. He couldn't punish her for open defiance because she never openly defied him. He couldn't break her psychologically because she never gave him access to her emotional state. And he couldn't isolate her from the other lionesses because their loyalty to her was based on demonstrated competence and character rather than fear or force. Every day of his reign, Scar was confronted with the reality that while he might have conquered the Pride Lands, he had never truly conquered its people. And that reality was embodied most clearly in the lioness who stood before him, acknowledging his power while refusing to grant him her submission. The most damning evidence of Sarabi's organized resistance lies in the tactical decisions that kept the Pride operational during the supposedly catastrophic years of Scar's reign. When we examine the logistics of survival in a collapsed ecosystem, the official narrative simply doesn't add up. The level of coordination required to maintain a functional Pride under these conditions reveals a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple endurance. Let's start with the hunting strategy. Lions are apex predators that require precise team coordination to bring down large prey. These formations and tactics don't maintain themselves. They require constant practice, clear leadership hierarchies, and adaptive strategy based on changing conditions. Yet somehow, during the years when the Pride Lands were supposedly barren and chaotic, the lionesses not only maintained these skills but demonstrated enhanced tactical awareness when called upon to fight in the final battle. This points to something remarkable. Sarabi wasn't just keeping the lionesses alive, she was keeping them sharp. While Scar assumed his subjects were growing weak and desperate, his former sister-in-law was running what amounted to a covert military training operation. Every hunt became a tactical exercise, every kill a lesson in coordination and leadership. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. Analysis of the background details during Scar's reign reveals something that should be impossible. Evidence of selective hunting patterns that suggest the lionesses were maintaining territorial boundaries and resource management strategies that Scar never authorized or even understood. Consider the prey distribution patterns visible in various scenes. Despite the apparent ecosystem collapse, certain areas of the Pride Lands show signs of careful wildlife management, almost as if someone was implementing conservation strategies to ensure long-term survival rather than short-term exploitation. This kind of forward-thinking resource management requires sophisticated understanding of ecological balance and, more importantly, authority to enforce hunting restrictions among the Pride members. The implications are staggering. While Scar was focused on immediate gratification and displays of power, Sarabi was implementing sustainable survival strategies that would preserve the foundation for eventual recovery. She wasn't just thinking about surviving his reign, she was actively preparing for its end. This brings us to one of the most intriguing mysteries in the entire film, the absent lioness phenomenon. Throughout Scar's reign, we see remarkably few adult lionesses in group scenes, yet we know the Pride maintained its numbers. Where were they, and what were they doing during their absence from Scar's direct supervision? The answer becomes clear when we consider the intelligence requirements of effective resistance. Someone had to monitor the borders, track the movement of remaining prey, maintain communication with any surviving animal communities, and most crucially, gather information about potential threats or opportunities. The lionesses weren't just absent, they were deployed. Sarabi had created a reconnaissance network that kept her informed about conditions throughout the Pride Lands, while maintaining plausible deniability about their activities. When questioned, these absences could always be explained as hunting expeditions or territory patrols, activities that even Scar would recognize as necessary for Pride survival. But the most sophisticated aspect of her intelligence operation involved information control. Scar's decision-making was consistently based on incomplete or misleading information about the true state of his kingdom. He believed the Pride Lands were irreversibly damaged, that the ecosystem had collapsed beyond recovery, that his subjects were entirely dependent on his leadership for survival. All of these beliefs were systematically reinforced by the information he received from the lionesses. This wasn't accidental. Sarabi understood that tyrants are most vulnerable when they base their strategies on flawed intelligence. By controlling what Scar knew about his own kingdom, she could influence his decisions while maintaining the appearance of helpless compliance. Every report about prey scarcity, every update on territorial conditions, every assessment of the pride's capabilities was filtered through her strategic objectives. The brilliance of this approach becomes apparent when we consider Scar's increasing paranoia and erratic behavior over time. He wasn't just responding to external pressures, he was reacting to a carefully orchestrated information campaign designed to undermine his confidence and decision-making capabilities. Sarabi was conducting psychological warfare at the strategic level, not just the personal level. Perhaps most remarkably, evidence suggests she maintained this intelligence network's loyalty through pure leadership competence rather than force or manipulation. The lionesses who risked their lives gathering information and maintaining operational security did so because they trusted her judgment and shared her vision for the pride's future. This trust becomes even more significant when we consider the ultimate objective of her resistance campaign: preparing for Simba's return. The precision with which the lionesses responded to his arrival, their immediate readiness for coordinated action, their seamless integration into his restoration efforts, none of this was coincidental. Sarabi had been preparing them for this moment throughout Scar's entire reign. She maintained not just their physical capabilities and tactical skills, but their emotional connection to the pride's original values and structure. When Simba arrived, he didn't find a broken, demoralized group of survivors. He found a disciplined, unified force ready to reclaim their homeland. The scope of this preparation reveals the true scale of Sarabi's resistance operation. She wasn't just preserving the pride's ability to survive, she was preserving its ability to govern. Every skill, every relationship, every institutional memory necessary for legitimate leadership had been carefully maintained and passed down through the years of Scar's rule. This wasn't just resistance. It was revolutionary preparation. Sarabi had created the conditions for a complete restoration of the original order, while making it appear to Scar that she was simply managing the decline of a defeated population. The depth of strategic thinking this required is breathtaking in its complexity and audacity. Now we arrive at the masterpiece of Sarabi's resistance campaign, the confrontation that has been misunderstood by audiences for decades. The scene where Scar demands she become his queen isn't a desperate tyrant making his final play for legitimacy. It's the moment when years of psychological warfare reach their inevitable conclusion, and Sarabi deployed her most devastating weapon: the complete destruction of Scar's narrative about himself. Let's dissect this encounter moment by moment, because every gesture, every pause, every word choice reveals the sophisticated tactical thinking behind what appears to be a simple act of defiance. The scene opens with Scar's approach, and immediately we see something crucial. He's the one seeking this confrontation. After years of ruling through fear and force, he finds himself compelled to ask for something he cannot simply take: validation from the one lioness whose opinion still matters to him. This reversal of initiative is the first sign that the power dynamic has fundamentally shifted. Watch Sarabi's positioning as he approaches. She doesn't flee, doesn't cower, but she also doesn't advance to meet him. Instead, she maintains perfect spatial control. Close enough to engage, far enough to avoid being cornered. This isn't accidental. She's controlling the geography of their confrontation just as deliberately as she's controlling its psychological terrain. Scar's opening gambit reveals his desperation immediately. "I've always thought you were the most beautiful of lionesses." Notice what he's doing here. He's attempting to establish a personal connection that bypasses his political authority. He's not speaking as king to subject, but as male to female. This represents a complete abandonment of his power position. Kings don't need to seduce their subjects into compliance. Sarabi's response is surgical in its precision. "What do you want, Scar?" 4 words that accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. First, she refuses to engage with his personal approach, forcing him back into his political role. Second, she uses his chosen name rather than any title, subtly reinforcing that she recognizes him as the lion who chose to become someone else, not as legitimate royalty. Third, she makes him articulate his demands explicitly, removing any pretense of subtlety or dignity from his position. The genius of this tactic becomes clear in Scar's immediate response. He abandons his seductive approach and reveals his true desperation. "I want you to be my queen." This isn't a romantic proposal, it's a political transaction he's trying to disguise as personal choice. By forcing him to state his intentions directly, Sarabi has stripped away his carefully constructed narrative and exposed the transactional nature of his offer. But watch what happens next. Scar tries to sweeten the deal. The two of us together, we could have our own pride, our own place. This is where his fundamental misunderstanding of power becomes most apparent. He's offering her partnership in building something new, completely missing that her loyalty isn't to any pride or place, but to the legitimate structure he destroyed. Sarabi's rejection is perfectly calculated. We are one. Two words that devastate Scar's entire worldview. She's not rejecting his offer because she finds him personally repugnant, though she certainly does. She's rejecting it because it represents a fundamental betrayal of everything she stands for. By invoking the concept of unity, the same philosophy Mufasa taught about the circle of life, she's making it clear that her loyalty lies with principles that transcend personal survival or comfort. This is where Scar makes his fatal error. Faced with philosophical rejection, he resorts to the only tool he truly understands: intimidation. Mufasa is gone, he snarls, moving closer. But notice Sarabi's response to this threat. She doesn't back down, doesn't show fear. Instead, she does something remarkable. She smiles. That smile is perhaps the most devastating moment in the entire confrontation. It's not defiance or bravery in the face of death. It's the expression of someone who has just seen their opponent reveal their complete lack of understanding about what they're actually fighting over. Scar thinks this is about him versus Mufasa, alive versus gone, present versus past. Sarabi knows this is about legitimacy versus force, principle versus expedience, the future versus the present. And then comes the moment that has been quoted and misunderstood for generations. No, Scar. He lives in you. This isn't nostalgia or wishful thinking. This is a precision strike at the core of Scar's psychological defenses. With 6 words, Sarabi accomplishes something remarkable. She forces Scar to confront the reality that everything he's done to distinguish himself from his brother has actually made him more like Mufasa's opposite, not his replacement. Watch Scar's physical reaction. He doesn't respond with anger or dismissal. He recoils as if struck. Because he has been struck, not physically but psychologically, Sarabi has just articulated something he spent years trying to avoid acknowledging. That his entire identity as king is defined not by his own merits, but by his relationship to the brother he destroyed. The brilliance of this psychological attack becomes clear when we consider what Sarabi is actually saying. She's not claiming that Mufasa lives on in memory or spirit. She's pointing out that Scar's obsession with distinguishing himself from Mufasa has made Mufasa the central organizing principle of his entire reign. Every decision, every policy, every action has been motivated by the need to prove he's not his brother. In trying to escape Mufasa's shadow, he's made that shadow the defining feature of his rule. This realization triggers Scar's most violent reaction in the scene. He strikes Sarabi not out of royal displeasure with a disobedient subject, but out of personal rage at having his deepest psychological wound exposed. The blow isn't political punishment, it's the lashing out of someone whose carefully constructed self-image has just been shattered. But even here, Sarabi's strategic thinking is evident. By provoking Scar into this public display of violence against her, she's accomplished something crucial. She's demonstrated to any witnesses that his authority rests on brutality rather than consent. The lionesses who see their queen struck for speaking truth will remember this moment when the time comes to choose sides. Scar's final words in the confrontation reveal just how completely Sarabi has outmaneuvered him. Get out! Get out! Get out! He's not banishing a rebellious subject. He's fleeing from a conversation he cannot win. The queen who supposedly had no power has just forced the king to retreat from his own throne room. This confrontation wasn't Sarabi's last stand against tyranny. It was her final examination of Scar's psychological state, confirming what years of resistance had already suggested, that he was fundamentally unstable, dependent on external validation, and vulnerable to strategic pressure at his core identity. She had learned everything she needed to know about her enemy's weaknesses, and now she could prepare for the endgame with complete confidence in his predictable responses. The scene ends with Sarabi leaving on her own terms, having accomplished objectives that Scar couldn't even perceive, much less counter. She had turned what he intended as his moment of ultimate dominance into a demonstration of his fundamental weakness. The resistance wasn't ending, it was preparing for its final phase. The true genius of Sarabi's resistance campaign becomes undeniable when we examine what happened the moment Simba returned to the Pride Lands. The speed and precision with which the lionesses transitioned from apparent subjugation to coordinated rebellion reveals years of careful preparation that most viewers have completely overlooked. Consider the logistics of that final battle. Within minutes of Simba's arrival, the lionesses had formed tactical units, established clear command structures, and executed complex maneuvers against Scar's hyena forces. This level of military readiness doesn't emerge spontaneously from a population that has been broken and demoralized for years. It requires continuous training, maintained hierarchies, and above all, unshakable confidence in eventual victory. Watch the lionesses' faces during the confrontation between Simba and Scar. There's no surprise, no confusion about whose side to take, no hesitation about abandoning their supposed ruler. They move with the certainty of soldiers who have been waiting for their moment to strike. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. This was the activation of a resistance network that had been dormant but never dismantled. But the most revealing evidence of Sarabi's strategic preparation lies in something that happens so quickly, most audiences miss it entirely. The seamless reintegration of pride structures the moment Scar's authority collapsed. Within hours of the battle's end, the lionesses had re-established hunting formations, territorial boundaries, and social hierarchies that perfectly mirrored the pre-Scar organization. This kind of institutional restoration is impossible unless the institutional knowledge was preserved throughout the period of disruption. Someone had been maintaining not just the lioness's physical capabilities, but their understanding of how a functional pride operates under legitimate leadership. Someone had been keeping alive the memory of what they were fighting to restore. The parallel to historical resistance movements is striking and illuminating. Throughout human history, the most successful underground organizations have shared certain characteristics. They maintain alternative power structures, preserve institutional knowledge, and prepare their members psychologically for the moment when open resistance becomes possible. Sarabi's operation exhibited all of these features with remarkable sophistication. Consider the French resistance during World War II, or the underground networks that preserved Jewish culture during periods of persecution, or the way indigenous communities maintained their traditions despite centuries of attempted cultural destruction. In each case, success depended not on dramatic gestures of defiance, but on the patient, systematic preservation of identity and capability until conditions allowed for restoration. Sarabi employed these same principles with masterful effectiveness. She understood that successful resistance isn't about defeating the oppressor through direct confrontation. It's about ensuring that when the oppressor's system inevitably collapses, there's still something worth rebuilding and people capable of rebuilding it. This brings us to the most provocative implication of this analysis. What if the entire Lion King narrative has been fundamentally misunderstood? What if this isn't really the story of a young prince reclaiming his birthright, but the story of a queen executing the most sophisticated political strategy in Disney history? Think about it from this perspective. Simba's return wasn't the catalyst that triggered Scar's downfall. It was the culmination of a process that Sarabi had been orchestrating for years. By the time the young prince arrived, Scar's psychological defenses had been systematically undermined, his support base eroded, and his opponents prepared for coordinated action. Simba provided the symbolic legitimacy necessary for restoration, but the actual conditions for victory had been created by his mother's relentless campaign of strategic resistance. This reframing raises fascinating questions about power, gender, and leadership in Disney's storytelling. The traditional narrative celebrates the heroic prince who overcomes adversity through courage and determination. But what if the real hero was the queen who spent years laying the groundwork for that apparent heroism to succeed? Sarabi's approach to resistance challenges conventional notions of what political power looks like. She wielded influence without holding office, commanded loyalty without giving orders, and shaped events without taking credit. Her power was invisible precisely because it was real, rooted in competence, trust, and strategic thinking rather than force or formal authority. The implications extend far beyond a single animated film. Sarabi's story suggests that the most effective forms of resistance often operate beneath the surface of visible politics. That true leadership sometimes means creating conditions for others to succeed, and that power based on legitimacy and consent will ultimately triumph over power based on force and fear. But perhaps the most unsettling implication of this analysis is what it suggests about our ability to recognize sophisticated political maneuvering when it doesn't conform to traditional expectations. How many other simple stories contain layers of complexity that we've missed because we weren't looking for them? How many other characters have we underestimated because their methods don't match our preconceptions about how power operates? Sarabi's silent rebellion forces us to reconsider not just the Lion King, but our broader assumptions about resistance, leadership, and political change. Her story suggests that the most transformative political actions often happen in quiet moments, through patient work, and by people who never seek recognition for their contributions to history. The queen who appeared to lose everything when Mufasa perished may actually have orchestrated one of the most complete political victories in storytelling history. She didn't just survive tyranny, she systematically dismantled it from within, while preparing the foundation for legitimate governance to return. Her rebellion wasn't silent because she lacked the power to speak loudly. It was silent because silence was her most effective weapon. In the end, Sarabi's story challenges us to look more carefully at who really holds power, how change actually happens, and what true leadership looks like when it operates without fanfare or recognition. Her legacy isn't just the restoration of the Pride Lands. It's a masterclass in how patient, strategic thinking can triumph over brute force and how real queens create the conditions for kingdoms to flourish long after they're gone. The question that remains is this: how many other Sarabis are operating in stories we think we understand, quietly shaping the world while others take credit for the changes they've made possible? Perhaps the real magic of Disney isn't in the fairy tale endings, but in the sophisticated political realities hiding just beneath the surface of seemingly simple stories.